and welcome to Ludgate's 2022 International Women's Day Break the Bias event in conjunction with our corporate sponsor AIB. Once again, we have a fabulous lineup of keynote speakers and panelists today, all contributing to the debate on how we as women can break the bias and indeed are obliged and compelled to continue our efforts to ultimately achieve gender equality for women. Our IWD virtual event is one of the highlights of the year for Ludgate in our series of knowledge sharing webinars, all of which are free to our audience. Each month we introduce a new theme and topic and bring together leading experts from the region and beyond to discuss hot topics of the day. Of course, through the pandemic, we became very accustomed to the virtual platform, while now as we emerge from its clutches, it's probably fair to say it's a love-hate relationship. Zoom allows us to attend without having to dedicate the entire day to an event. However, the flip side is we do miss the personal connection. Going forward, Ludgate hopes to be able to bring you a mix of both in-person and virtual events going forward. It's important, I think, for us to get to know each other again. Benefits of Zoom aside, let's dive into the exciting hour ahead. We're fortunate to have Fiona O'Donovan, a Public Affairs and Communications Executive with the Cork Chamber of Commerce, agreed to be our MC this morning. Fiona is a longtime friend of Ludgate, being from the region and having covered us in her prior role with Red FM, and we're thrilled to have her join us today. We're also delighted to bring you Emily Hagerty, one of our wonderful Olympic medal winners in the most recent Olympic Games, and Holly Cairns, who became a TD in 2020 and will go down in history for many things, including the voting pact with Minister McEntee, who was then enabled to take her maternity leave, who is another trailblazer, knowing her voting impact would not jeopardise government, her voting record. Both Emily and Holly have already made it into the history books of Ireland, and for that, I thank you both for your contribution to breaking the bias and reducing the gender divide. Our panel is then made up of another fabulous team of trailblazers in their own disciplines. We have Dr. Fiona Edwards-Murphy, UCC grad in Elect Engineering and CEO of APIS Protect, an agri-tech solution provider. Fiona was included on the 2021 Forbes Europe's 30 Under 30 for her work ensuring the survival of the honeybee and developing technology involving advanced sensors and machine learning solutions to maintain and improve bee health. We have Claire Meskel, another UCC grad and alumni of the Ignite program for entrepreneurs. Claire is a speech and language therapist turned entrepreneur and founder of Teletherapy, a startup medtech company. Teletherapy is a medical device that supports Parkinson's patients and their clinicians. More groundbreaking female founders and entrepreneurs. We have Carol Ho join us from Baseworks. Carol is the COO and is responsible for leading the company's operations as well as the sales and marketing efforts. Baseworks is a one-stop management software solution for co-working spaces like Ludgate and helps us manage our daily operations. And it has empowered over 400 co-working spaces, digital hubs across Ireland, and has been involved in the launch of the connectedhub.ie platform, which the Western Development Commission and the Department of Rural and Community Development have been leading the charge on. So Carol is also the 2021 National President of the Junior Chamber International Ireland and was the first non-European elected for this role in the last 64 years. So delighted to have you here this morning, Carol, especially when Baseworks is one of our key companies operating out of the Ludgate hub. So delighted to have you here. Our final two panelists come from the world of finance. We all grumble about taxes, but we know we have to pay them to ensure a thriving society. And we have Mairead O'Driscoll, a chartered accountant and tax advisor, aka the tax nerd, who is going to talk all things tax. Mairead has managed to secure over 16,000 followers on her Instagram tax nerd account. And I have to take my hat off to her for being able to influence the Insta community on such an essential and relevant topic for all of us. She tells me the key to that is basically telling people she's going to help them get money back from revenue. So I think it's good to understand those key drivers there. And her page on Instagram essentially demystifies tax and makes tax information more accessible to everybody. And finally, we have Anne Mccormick, who joins us from AIB. AIB have been long-term supporters of Ludgate and are our key corporate sponsor. And Anne is going to talk to us about how AIB supports women in a male-dominated environment. And Anne is head of financial management and reporting in AIB with over 30 years of experience. And she's currently chair of the Mentor Her program, which is an award-winning program that aligns AIB's talent and culture goals and has a particular focus on gender diversity. So an absolutely impressive lineup to hear from today. And I want to thank you all for the time and commitment that you're giving us this morning on such an important topic. And wish you all a happy IWD elongated day, week, month, year. We know it's not just a one-day event. And without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Fiona to start the morning's discussion. Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Grainne, and good morning, everyone. Grainne is actually one of my own role models in terms of her own inspirational story. She joined Ludgate in Skibbereen back in July 2020, and she brings with her so much experience, a wealth of international management experience spanning 20 years in locations as amazing as Tokyo and New York. So it's great to be part of an event that recognises some of the most inspirational leaders we have amongst us, but that also encourages debate and thought on what more can be done to break the bias and close that gender gap. By way of a very brief introduction, I'm part of a very busy public affairs team in Cork Chamber of Commerce, and we work closely with our members and stakeholders to drive a sustainable agenda in Cork, where a thriving business community will ensure its resilience into the future. My academic background is in government and public policy, public and political communications, and modern Irish. And prior to joining Cork Chamber, I worked in the world of journalism for 10 years. So I've had the honour and the pleasure of meeting some of the most incredible women over the last decade or so, and I can tell you that today's speakers and panel are among them. So it's an honour to be here as part of International Women's Day. Before I hand you over to our spotlight speakers, I just want to make you aware that the chat is open for anyone that has any questions, and I'll filter them through then when we get to our panel discussion. So you've heard enough from me now, so over to Emily Hagerty. Emily won a bronze medal in the women's 4 at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and in doing so made history with her teammates in winning Irish rowing's first Olympic medal. She's just 23 years of age, which is absolutely amazing, and the success that she has had has been preceded by so many more feats in her sport. I couldn't even list them, to be honest with you. When I was researching you, Emily, I just had to really bring it down to one, and I'm going to let you tell the rest of your story yourself, because it is so incredible. So I might follow up with a little bit about your own views on the gender gap in sport, but over to you, Emily, and maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about your own story. I mean, we've all seen and we've all heard about you, we've all read about you and seen you on TV, but we'd like to hear it from you too. So over to you, Emily.
Hi, so yeah, I started rowing when I was 11 in Skibbereen Rowing Club, and to be fair, like I was really lucky. I think particularly like in my sport, I can't say it for all sports, but we are quite lucky that I don't experience much of a bias, especially considering when I started when I was 11. You know, both the men and women had the same access to equipment, same access to coaching. There was never kind of one prioritized over the other. So I guess that would have been a big thing I never experienced as potently as like my friends who would have taken part in other sports. So yeah, I joined the senior team when I went to college. So I would have just been 19. So, and it was an unreal time to be part of rowing in Ireland, because kind of we went from one women's boat in London to 2 come Rio, and then there was 4 women's boat in Tokyo. So like it went from 1 to 9 women representing rowing in Ireland at the Olympics come over 2 cycles. So yeah, and it's definitely been really progressive, I think, in rowing, because even this past cycle was the first time there was equal participation for men and women across the board in rowing. So, and I'm quite fortunate that it was the women's 4 brought that equality. So I definitely think even, you know, on the national team, it's the same equipment, same coaches, like we get equal access, we do the same program. When it comes to international, you know, men's and women's event, like every second event on race day will be a men's and a women's. There's never really, we do get the same coverage, and we do get the same kind of, when there is a crowd of people there, like they're there to see the men and the women. So I wouldn't really have the same experience as other sports maybe who don't compete at the same venues or don't compete on the same day as men. So I'm quite fortunate that way, and I'm quite fortunate to be in an environment now where like the women's team has grown so much even since I joined the team. Like it's just an incredible environment to be a part of, and just I really feel like we do really push each other on, and it's kind of cool that the women do outnumber the men here, and kind of has been that way for the past few years. So yeah, I definitely think there's room to improve, like particularly with coaching. You don't see as many female coaches kind of make it to the top and make it to like the international. There's definitely a few there, and you would hear a lot about them, but there's definitely a lot more men involved in the coaching side of things internationally than women. And I know Rowing Ireland have implemented their own kind of internship, trying to get more women involved and try to get them in the pathway to get a job internationally. But yeah, no, that's probably one area I could see improvement on, but otherwise I do think the sport of rowing itself has done quite well.
Emily, you know, I suppose it's great to hear that, and it's great to hear that you haven't encountered some of the obstacles that we know other women in different sports have. So in that respect, do you think maybe that some barriers have been broken down significantly when we see successes like your own and that of the likes of maybe Rachel Blackmore, the jockey, you know, in a very male dominated sport, just completely blazing a trail? Do you think that change has started in the world of sport?
I definitely think so. And I definitely think the visibility of it is just so important. And I don't think we realize the kind of effect it has on people. Like, there's young girls at home now, like, kind of they can see a successful female jockey and can definitely kind of aim for it. Whereas I think back along, you know, I'm very lucky. Sunita Pushpur was always a massive figurehead for the sport of rowing in Ireland. And, you know, she definitely encouraged the women to continue on and continue training. So I definitely think visibility has much more of an impact than we can imagine.
And you mentioned visibility there, and I think one of the biggest things we talk about every year is the match attendance at All Ireland final days, and we compare the men's to the women's football, for instance, and the difference in the attendance rates in Croke Park, and that visibility is there. It can't be denied. Do you think that the media has a role to play in terms of, you know, shaping a different view on sport and on women in sport, and indeed the public as well, in terms of their attendance and their engagement?
I definitely think the media, yeah. I feel particularly when, you know, considering the men do get a lot of coverage in terms of other sports and everything, you know, you're more interested in following people you're aware of and you know their story. And I definitely think the media, in terms of like letting people tell their story and share their experiences at sport, it does perk your interest to know kind of the work that goes on behind the scenes, to kind of follow through then and see the work on the day, that sort of way.
You mentioned you were around 11 when you got engaged and involved in sport. Is it important from a young age to encourage young girls to take part in sport and to take part in, just, I suppose, to ensure that they know that they can do whatever they want to do, regardless of their gender, in the sporting world?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think, you know, we're really lucky we're in a time where the women in sport in Ireland are just so successful, from boxing to golf to hockey, rowing, you know, and it definitely does encourage people to stick with it, because it does definitely break down barriers in terms of how far you can take it in the sport.
And from what you've seen, and I know obviously you had your own teammates, and we all saw you on the Late, you were all highly supportive of each other and you just looked like a great team. But in the background, you know, your teammates, be they female or male, is that support important? Is it important for men to support their colleagues as well, and their teammates in progressing and in breaking down that barrier? I mean, I will say this later as well, this isn't about, you know, ensuring that men don't succeed in comparison to women. It's about enabling everyone to succeed.
I definitely think it plays a massive role. Like, for example, like in our sessions coming up to racing season, we'd all do the same sessions, we'd all be ranked, and it's kind of both the men and the women pushing each other on and kind of aiming for that top spot in training kind of does help us succeed on the day then.
So, I mean, Emily, you know, in terms of your sporting achievements, you know, it's great to hear that, you know, there hasn't really been a bias for you or a gender gap, or you haven't felt it. Have you felt it in any other areas of your life? Just as, you know, as a young woman from a small town, not so small anymore, but, you know, from a West Cork town, have you ever felt that, or have you ever felt, you know, a barrier to get to anywhere you needed to go?
I never really felt a barrier, no. I guess I was, you know, I went to an all-girls school in Skibbereen, Mercy Heights at the time. So I guess we were all just very focused on kind of, you know, getting through school, like doing well. And then I think, to be fair, I haven't done too much else in my life bar kind of education and rowing, but I do find that I haven't personally faced massive barriers.
But I suppose in terms of, you know, the school scenario as well, and the educational scenario, because you're not that long out of it, you know, there are certain areas that perhaps it's not that women aren't encouraged to go into them. It's probably an attitude thing, like, you know, apprenticeships, carpentry, and you know, even engineering. And I know there's a lot more women going into that now than ever did before. But do you think that there needs to be a change at that level, Emily, as a 23-year-old woman who's not long left school and has had the successes that you've had? Do you see that there needs to be maybe a change in mindset in those areas?
Yeah, I think the biggest kind of barrier in that situation would be kind of people's attitude towards, let's say, women kind of engineering, or women, like I'm in STEM now. So I guess there is a big push for women to get more involved, but I definitely think potentially attitudes up the line are a bit different, because I do know, kind of going beyond that, there is kind of luckily women, the number of women in STEM is improving and everything, but I suppose in the past it would have been very male dominated.
What would you say to anyone who is watching this, or who has followed your story and would like to try something, you know, that you have done, or to get involved in a sport and maybe feels that, you know, they can't, that it's not accessible for them, particularly young girls? What would you say to them?
I would say the path to success, whatever you kind of consider to be success, is definitely not linear. And it's like, it's very much, there's going to be lots of setbacks, but it's very much a case of like, have your goal in mind and go for it. And regardless of what might kind of stand in your way, you're definitely able to overcome it. It just sometimes takes a bit of time and takes a bit of patience, but it's definitely not the easiest of roads, but it's definitely worth sticking with.
Are you glad that you stuck with that road? You know, I mean, I'm sure there was, I think I saw a headline about you once that you had missed your 18th birthday celebrations because you were so busy training. You know, man or woman, sacrifice needs to be made. Is that fair statement to make?
Yeah, definitely. I guess kind of the reward, you need to keep the like end goal in mind. And I guess back then I didn't think an Olympic medal would be kind of the goal at the time, but like definitely those small goals along the way. And just, if you do ever find yourself in a situation where it's not going the direction you wanted to, just kind of stick with it. You know, I've had so many setbacks in my own kind of athletic career that there was so many times I just wanted to pack it in. But then it's kind of if you want it bad enough, it's definitely worth sticking with.
Have you had those queries from younger people? You know, have you had those, you know, how can I do it? Or how did you do it? Or, you know, have you had those queries from people coming up behind you that need those words of encouragement when they just feel like the easiest thing to do would be just to throw in the towel?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of, they'd be wondering about the experiences behind the scenes and like kind of what it's like coming onto like a much more kind of experienced team and everything. And obviously, you know, it was quite difficult at times, but it's something you do need to stick with, and you do kind of find your own place within the team. So yeah, I think it's kind of the like experience behind the events and like the kind of road to Tokyo, essentially. That would definitely be what people are intrigued to know.
Emily, thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with us this morning. It's a great source of pride, not only for your hometown in Skibbereen, but for us here in Cork and across the country to call you one of our own. So thank you so much for that. Our next spotlight speaker needs no introduction. We have the honour of having Cork TD for the Southwest, Holly Cairns, here with us this morning by way of a very brief introduction. Deputy Cairns of the Social Democrats has championed issues such as women's rights, important issues around agriculture, food and the marine, rural development, social justice and disability. She hails from a farm in West Cork and without doubt is one of the most inspiring politicians of our time. But as the only female TD representing us here in Cork, she has encountered her own obstacles on her journey to Leinster House, and I think it's fair to say she continues to fight for and encounter difficulties in the road to championing the issues that I've just mentioned. Holly, can you tell us a little bit this International Women's Day about your own story, and I suppose your own views as well on the gender gap that exists in politics?
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks to Grainne as well for the invitation, and Fiona Ryan for setting all of this up. It's great to be here this morning, even if it is remotely. And I think just first of all, following Emily is a really tough act. I think we're all in total awe of her achievements and resilience. And you mentioned there, Fiona, when you were speaking to Emily about the kind of seeing it to be it. And I remember being in Church Cross when Emily's Welcome Home was happening, and all the young girls and boys coming up to meet her and to hold the medal and touch the medal. I've no doubt that Emily has inspired a whole generation in West Cork. So just to note that before I kick off. But I suppose just in relation to International Women's Day, I have to say that I'm in two minds about it increasingly. I think it's a chance to celebrate women and to mark progress, and that's so important. But it is also a reminder of the consistent challenges that we face in work, in business, in the street even. So speaking in the Dáil yesterday, there's kind of an annual slot now for Women's Day, and actually drew inspiration from Louise O'Neill, and another West Cork woman, and I think we're all very proud of. And in her column in the Examiner at the weekend, she explained that she didn't feel like celebrating International Women's Day this year. She described the ongoing issues that girls and women face, and the kind of wariness of having to raise those same issues over and over and over again, and the disillusionment that she feels when, you know, nothing actually ever changes. I have to say, I know exactly where she's coming from. I genuinely considered giving the exact same speech that I did last year in the Dáil yesterday. I wondered, would anybody even notice? Would I even notice? I could talk about the same issues with a few different statistics, updated figures, year after year after year. It seems the same problems. We're faced with them over and over again. Nothing seems to change, and there's amazing work being done by women and their allies. Progress is happening slowly, but it takes so much effort, and it often just takes a huge battle. It's the reality. We still have to fight for places in leadership, for example, for things like period products to be seen as essential, for female role models to be given a platform. The list goes on. And then at the same time, it's really important to acknowledge the changes that we do make, and to celebrate the amazing women that we know and that we look up to. It's only right that we have a day to do that, I think. Besides the 8th of March, there's only Mother's Day, and there is Women's Little Christmas that society recognises women's contribution. And those other 2 days are very much to acknowledge the reality of our role and our obligations in families. And they fall short of valuing us as kind of whole independent people who have professional lives and hobbies and ambitions. So International Women's Day is better in that sense. I even made the point yesterday, I think, that it can often feel like we don't even have International Women's Day. It's a known fact that online searches for International Men's Day spike on International Women's Day. And often, social media is flooded with people saying, what about International Men's Day? And when is it? And by people, I mean mainly men saying that, but just for the record, it's on the 19th of November. And I think as well, if people are only concerned about Men's Day on Women's Day, it's safe to say we know what the priority is there. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Feminism is about empowerment and equality, not anything to do with being anti-men. Our concerns are too easily and often brushed aside and dismissed with that. It's important to acknowledge the challenges as well as the successes, I suppose, is the point of trying to make. But today's theme around breaking the bias, I think, is a really interesting point, and it forces us to consider stereotypes and discrimination that affect everybody. We rightly focus on how bias and discrimination impacts women in the workplace, how stereotypes force women into certain roles. I mentioned that there, things like engineering, and or forces women out of certain roles. How young women are denied opportunities because they might have the audacity to procreate, and how women have to put up with so-called banters and stares and unwanted touching. And I think in terms of a bias, female farmers are a prime example of stereotypes holding women back. Like you said, I'm from an agricultural background, and there are really deeply ingrained social barriers to women in agriculture. Despite having the passion and experience, there's still parents who wouldn't let a daughter take over a farm, for example. They see it as a man's job, their son's job. Young female farmers can often feel, or not often feel, but often be the only woman in a course that they're doing. Or be the only woman at an event. And I think that's a feeling that many of us on the panel today are probably familiar with. The Women in Agriculture Stakeholder Group do incredible work for anybody, anyone tuned in today interested in agriculture, in encouraging greater participation. But when farming organisations are dominated by men, and when, for example, the Oireachtas Agriculture Committee in here doesn't have a single female TD on it, progress is really restricted. And bias cuts both ways. We all know men who would have made really incredible nurses, for example, or carers, but societal pressures would prevent them from taking that route. And in politics, for example, male TDs get to spend very little time with their families. I was recently talking to male colleagues who were genuinely fearful of taking paternity leave because of the reaction they might get from constituents. And I think thankfully we are seeing a slow change around the culture in that area. But bias goes beyond gender, and Ireland has one of the lowest rates of employment of people with disabilities in the EU, and as a result we have far higher rates of social exclusion and poverty for disabled people in Ireland than all other EU countries. Just when we're talking about breaking the bias as the theme, I think it's really important to highlight that. I'm a member of the Oireachtas Disability Matters Committee, and we hear about struggles like faced by people with disabilities and their families, and we know public services need to be massively increased and improved and invested in. However, we also hear about disabled people being held back. A parent of a disabled young man outlined how it was important for her son to start working as a teenager just like his peers. But we have a legacy then of being overprotective of people with disabilities, and we have to confront those biases to be truly inclusive, and it's coming from a good place, but it's a bias nonetheless. The committee also heard from a man who had a physical disability, cerebral palsy, due to a lack of oxygen at birth. And he provided an account of having to argue and work tirelessly to access supports for independent living. He's an incredibly passionate and capable advocate who literally just needs a personal assistant. As a category of people who most visibly encounter biases and stereotypes in social and professional life, we have an obligation to confront all our biases and stereotypes. While I've conflicted feelings about International Women's Day, events like this one are really lifting. I spoke in a secondary school on Monday in a disadvantaged area of the city, where I saw the work being done to empower young women, and the importance in day-to-day of recognising them and recognising that solidarity with other women, especially male-dominated areas, is absolutely essential. There were times on Cork County Council that I only got through meetings with that solidarity. I think party politics didn't matter. On some days it was about supporting each other, and that's really crucial. Conversations like this one are essential. I know I'm talking to a virtual room of successful women, and we all want to see it for other women, for disabled people and people from minority backgrounds to be given a fair chance.
Thanks, Holly. That's, some of the points you made there, they are as surprising as they are interesting, to be honest. But I suppose, if I can ask you about your own position in Leinster House and being the only female TD from Cork. The World Economic Forum estimates it will take 145 years to attain gender parity in politics. And that is a stat, and it reads like a stat, but the reality of that, and I've spoken to you about this recently enough, is that without representation, issues that actually affect not only women but men too are not being or coming to the fore early enough or quickly enough to make a change. For instance, you spoke an awful lot about maternity restrictions during COVID, and women and their partners, men were excluded from some of the biggest moments in their lives, and women were also had the stress and the emotional trauma of that. And that discussion didn't start happening soon enough. That's the reality of a lack of representation at a senior level like that. Is that a fair statement?
It is, and just initially going to apologise for I hope there's not noise interference. The dole bells go, there's nothing you can do about them, and the Shannon bells. Okay. But I suppose it's all in the name of the role, representation, and the idea is that we represent our constituents and work on their behalves, be it raising issues in the Dáil or on committees. And because we have such poor representation of women, what we find, and one of the things I said yesterday in the Dáil about International Women's Day, is there's too many issues facing women and there's too few public representatives raising them. And the maternity restrictions is a really, really good example of that. That was something I consistently raised for a year before there was any action on it. And, we saw that, throughout COVID around the decision-making tables, there was no women sitting at them. And that really played out. It's a really good example of it that, like you say, affected men so much as well. Oftentimes, people who are, actually all the time, people who are about to give birth, have just given birth, aren't in a position to be an organised lobby group that get onto their politicians about these issues. So a lot of the time it was partners getting in touch with me about it and encouraging me to consistently raise it. And I remember speaking to a few colleagues in the kind of corridors of Leinster House around that time, and it was when a lot more politicians were starting to be more vocal about the need to ease those restrictions, because it got to a stage where you go to the pub, have a drink, you go to a wedding, birth of your own, or indeed miss the birth of your own child. And I was talking to the TDs about it, trying to get them to raise it in the parliamentary parties to push for it. And one of them said to me, "Holly, you're not the only one who cares about women's issues." And I said, "Well, I know, but it'd be great if you could raise it then, if you also care about it." And he said, "Fair enough." And of course, it was around the same time that our Minister for Justice announced that she was pregnant and expecting the first Minister Cabinet ever, and that she was also going to take maternity leave, so a real trailblazer. And at the same time, I had TDs coming up to me saying, "Will you raise that again about the maternity restrictions because my wife is expecting?" Meanwhile, not raising it themselves, but also just really brought home the reality of how poor representation has been. Loads of these men were having children throughout this time and you wouldn't even know about it. Whereas one woman in politics was pregnant and it was in every newspaper in the country. So it's just that's one issue. We have so many issues. It's so intersectional. Housing is a women's issue. People fleeing domestic violence, trying to seek accommodation. Transport is a women's issue. If there isn't lit up bus stops and things like that, people don't even feel safe to go out. Every single issue essentially is women's issues. We can't just talk about it on International Women's Day. That is the problem. It needs to be, it's the other 364 days of the year that actually make a difference. And I have no doubt that if we had more women there making those decisions, we would see that play out in reality. Like I say, we always see it from the bottom up. That's happening. Take West Cork as an example, West Cork Women Against Domestic Violence, Emily, Hagerty, people like Grainne, all of that is happening from the ground up. We still need a top-down approach. So policy reflects society as well. Until there's more women in politics, I don't believe that will happen. Barriers there is, I suppose, a whole other topic, but ultimately what we see is that we've always had a majority party of two older parties that are around since the foundation of the state. Like most institutions, we see an institutional aversion to change. That's something that massively needs to be addressed. We don't see the same problem in newer parties. For example, in my own party, the Social Democrats, we're the only party in the country that has a gender balance. We're also one of the newest parties in the country with 2 female leaders. You see funding being pumped into getting more women involved in politics this week, of course, because it's International Women's Day, kind of a tokenism, but it doesn't cost anything to get women into politics. It's about a culture, and unfortunately that culture doesn't exist enough in our parties yet.
Holly, I'm conscious of time, but I just do want to ask you quickly, just in relation to I suppose you mentioned there, transport is a women's issue in terms of places being lit up so they can walk. We've had some really, really heartbreaking stories in the last couple of months in terms of women's safety and issues around that. Here in Cork, we've had headlines of spiking going on by form of injection. I don't think there's any parent when their child was going out or their teenager or their particularly a college goer that wasn't worried about this spiking issue that was going on. Given the worries that still exist there that shouldn't, what more needs to be done, and where would you hope we would be this time next year when we're talking at International Women's Day again? What advancements or developments would you hope to see over the next year so that we're not talking about these issues again? We're not talking about issues around women's basic issues around women's safety, basic issues around, I suppose, gender pay, as you said, the issues that came to the fore in COVID, healthcare, all those arenas. Where would you like to see us this time next year?
It's a really good question. I think a really important one. I think, it's important to kind of just briefly flash back to January, and there was the really tragic killing of Aisling Murphy. And that really, at that time, the appetite for change was palpable. Every political party, every organisation, everything was calling out for all of the things that we need to do, which we're going to do in a second, to address this kind of gender-based violence. By February, nearly, banter was back. People's memories are so short. So I think it's important to highlight that's why I referenced that we need this 364 days of the year, not when tragedies happen, not when another young life is lost, not just on International Women's Day, but at that time, we had a really good national conversation about what needed to be done. And there was a few things that were flagged that were, I think, quite crucial. So obviously things that we mentioned there, like domestic violence, refuge spaces, people, the majority of those of women being murdered is often in their own home. And when we have a housing crisis, and 1/3 of the recommended bare minimum refuge spaces under the Istanbul Convention, we leave people in danger quite literally with our policy and inaction. So that was one thing that was, unanimously agreed we needed to address, domestic violence refuge spaces. Another thing was sex education, and we have seen no action on that. And it was actually before the killing of Aisling Murphy, we brought forward a private member's business to change our sex education for it to be based in science and be based in fact and around consent and important things that young people need to learn. It's just been delayed. There's been no move on that. That's something that's really important. And I think it can sound so far removed from something like the situation we had with Aisling Murphy, because it seems like a random act. But I'd need a diagram really to show it, that the kind of the language and the culture around women and how that transpires into the other things we see happen is quite clear. And if it were random, every killing like that wouldn't be a female aged between kind of 16 and 35, those so-called random ones. Education, refuge spaces, all of those things that people were calling for at the time just need to be remembered day to day by government. And then, of course, in every single policy, we need to make sure that women are being considered, because it's a transport issue, it's a housing issue, it's an agriculture issue, it goes into everything. It can't be seen as this, it's always siloed, and we see that with disability rights as well. It just means we don't have any positive changes.
Thank you so much, Holly, for taking the time to be here with us this morning, and for your very honest overview of where we're at in closing that gender gap. And of course, it starts with representation and having role models, not just in politics, but at senior levels everywhere, that will inspire and encourage this generation, our generation, and future generations to break that bias and close that gap we've been talking about for far too long. So thank you so much, Holly. Before I introduce everyone to our panel this morning, for context ahead of our chat, I just want to point out some really interesting stats from the latest Global Gender Report. I think it'll really guide our conversation here this morning and will give us all food for thought, because when I was researching some of them, they really surprised me, actually. So according to the latest report, and that's the 2021 report, on its current trajectory, it'll take 135 years to close the gender gap worldwide. 135 years. Early and preliminary evidence suggests that the health emergency, COVID-19 and the related downturn, impacted women far more severely than men, partially reopening gaps that had already been closed. The slow progress in closing the economic participation and opportunity gap is the result of two opposing trends. So on the one hand, the proportion of women among skilled professionals continues to increase, as does progress towards wage equality, albeit at a slower pace. On the other hand, overall income disparities are still only partway towards being bridged, and there's a persistent lack of women in leadership positions, women representing just 27% of all manager positions. There has been some positive trends globally. So since the last edition of this report, there are more women in parliaments, and 2 countries have elected their first female prime minister, and gender gaps in educational attainment and health and survival are nearly closed. So there is some positive, but there is a long way to go yet. And this isn't about the rise of women and the fall of men. I just want to point that out. It's about breaking the bias. It's to ensure that everyone can play a role in forging gender parity. It's also about gender balance in terms of how the economy is suffering, because we don't have the balance correct. So we're missing out on, skills and a huge talent pool, because that gender equality and gender balance just is so off. And to discuss more about this and advocacy, inclusive mindsets, and I suppose tangible action, I'd like to introduce our panel. I'm only going to briefly introduce everyone because Grainne has already done that, so that's great. So there's Claire Mescal, founder and CEO of Teletherapy. Dr. Fiona Edwards-Murphy, she is the founder of APIS Protect, which is a uniquely placed design that she has come up with to disrupt a global well-established industry with robust technology developed by her following her award-winning PhD research at UCC. There's Carol Ho, COO of Baseworks, Mairead O'Driscoll, Chartered Accountant and Tax Advisor and creator of The Tax Nerd, an Instagram account we all need, I think. And very excitingly, we have with us also Anne Comish, Head of Financial Management and Reporting, COO at the AIB. So first, I'm going to start off with Claire, actually, because Claire, you originally qualified as a speech and language therapist. Your entrepreneurial journey began through the Ignite Startup Incubator Program at UCC, but you came from a predominantly female-dominated academic background. And I'm curious whether or not that helped you or prepared you or hindered you, as the case may be, for your own entrepreneurial journey, you know, coming from, I suppose, an arena where, and I remember, because I had friends in that course, it was nearly completely dominated by women. And I think as well, in terms of the staff, it was a lot of women. How did you find that transition?
Yeah, so I think definitely, as you said, it is female dominated. Traditionally, it's thought of as a female career. In college, there was one male in my course. And then on placements, my first job, it was all female. So I think I obviously, because of my background, came up with my idea to help with communication with people with Parkinson's. So I did the Ignite Startup Business Program. And I think one thing that I just remember from that first couple of weeks, and it's something Emily spoke about earlier, and Holly, I suppose, representation, and, you know, the phrase, you have to see it to be it. And I think in psychology, it's referred to as the role model intervention. And that definitely stood to me. While I had the expertise in my domain, like, could I be a woman in business? And the first couple of speakers we had, mentors, they were female. So I could see it and I could be it as well. So I think that definitely, you know, prepared me for a little bit of bias that maybe came across when people hear you move from speech therapy to the business world. You know, it's just that bias that's people have. I think they don't mean to have it, but it's important to question it when it comes up. So things like, oh, that's a great career, to be lovely to go back to, you know, if you're having a family, or things like that. And yes, it is a great career for anybody, you know, for anyone who wants to have a family, not just a woman. It's a great career for anyone who wants to help with communication difficulties. So I think I never had to question myself before as a speech therapist. And I definitely, you know, just that innate bias that people have in terms of what is a career for a woman versus a man. I think, you know, just to raise the awareness of bias that people have, they're not aware they have it. And, you know, it's not about creating conflict on a day-to-day basis, but it's just reminding people that that is a bias that you have, and we need to kind of remove it.
It's funny you mention that, because that's actually something I've heard in recent years an awful lot, because probably of the age I'm at and where I'm at in life. That'll be great for you now if you're starting a family, you know, that's a great career, you know, think of the time off you'd have to raise your kids. And look, yes, all very relevant points, but very relevant points in terms of a man too, you know. But a man would never be, it would never really be said to a man in that manner. So do you think comments like that are actually detrimental to some men entering a profession like yours, you know, entering I suppose a world where, you know, it is predominantly female dominated, speech and language therapy? Do you think that is, you know, the mindset maybe is part of the reason that the uptake for men is lower?
Absolutely. And I think especially at that vulnerable age that people are choosing a career, you know, they're very open to bias, and, you know, we haven't become our own people yet to stand up to that bias. So I think when, you know, an 18-year-old guy hears that, like, it's great to be like a stay-at-home dad, or it would be great to have that part-time off, or if you can work in a school and have the summer off, I think a 19-year-old isn't strong enough. Well, some 19-year-olds aren't. I wouldn't have been at an 18-year-old to say, you know, it shouldn't matter my gender in this career. So I think it does. And I think it's just, again, raising the awareness of the terminology we use around careers with young people in schools, and even as we like chat on discussions about this, to remove any innate bias that people might have.
And it's a fair point, as you said there, because you know, primary teaching as well is another work arena that is largely female dominated. But men have actually often said, and I have a few friends that are male teachers, that once they became a father, it was the most amazing balance for them in terms of, you know, the work-life balance that it gives you. But again, that conversation never had with an 18 or a 19-year-old. That conversation being had with an 18 or a 19-year-old woman, you know. And just on the opposite side of that, Fiona Edwards Murphy, I'm going to ask you a little bit, because you came from a course actually that was very male dominated. I think, were you the only woman in your?
I wasn't the only woman. There was in my class, so I studied electrical engineering at UCC. There were 35 in my class and 5 of us were girls, and that was in all of my 8 years during my undergrad and my PhD. That was the class with the most girls. It was 5 and 30 was the most girly class in that entire time. Yeah.
And have you seen, or when you were doing it, did you always hope you'd see a change in that ratio?
Definitely, I hoped I'd see a change, and I guess unfortunately I hadn't seen it trickle through by the time I left, unfortunately, and from engineering. I think one change that was made during the time that I was in UCC was that they changed it from, you know, the different sectors of engineering being their own entry. So like you decided when you were filling out your CAO whether you wanted to be an electrical engineer or a chemical engineer or a civil engineer, and it changed to a kind of a general entry. Which I think was definitely a step in the right direction, and hopefully, so that had only started when I left. So hopefully that has made an influence, because I know, like, for example, chemical engineering was 50-50, if not more women than men. And it's kind of like, it's strange what things people kind of get into their heads. Like, why would you be like, oh yeah, I'll definitely be a chemical engineer, but I'll absolutely not be an electrical engineer, for some reason.
And why do you think that is? Why, you know, when you were going to apply for it, what was the reaction like for you?
Maybe, I think, I'm not entirely sure, but it could have actually just been like electrical engineering is physics and chemical engineering is chemistry, and chemistry is a less male dominated science. Even in like secondary school, I mean, like, I know plenty of girls like that. Even some of the girls who came into electrical engineering with me had gone to all girls schools, and physics wasn't on their curriculum. Like, they had to go outside of school to study physics for their leaving cert. And just, you know, maybe less girls have done physics, maybe less girls have even had the option to study physics, because it's actually, you know, if you like chemistry, you'll like physics, and vice versa. You know, they're not that different.
And how did coming from that environment prepare you for what you did? Because, I mean, the product you have created is, I mean, it has the capability of changing the world for the better. It really does, ensuring survival and optimal management of the honeybee, one of our most valuable resources. You know, did you think when you went into that degree that this is the route you would go down, or did it kind of encourage you to think, well, look, I've got this far, I've done this, and I've done it in a male-dominated environment, I can do anything?
I would say yes and no to both of those. I mean, like, definitely when I started out studying electrical engineering, did I expect I would be working with bees? No. Did I expect I'd be an entrepreneur? No, absolutely not. But yeah, definitely the experience of going through engineering like that, what I absolutely fell in love with was the topic of wireless sensor networks, because it was all about like taking the concepts that I was learning about in college, you know, like circuit design and, you know, the real world applications and stuff like that, and taking it into the real world. So that's what I absolutely fell in love with. And I think that's what and maybe a lot of women that I've spoken to since I kind of specialized in wireless sensor networks, the whole idea that treating engineering as this is a skill that I've got that I can take and impact anything I want to, or anything that I want to be able to contribute towards in the real world. I feel like that's a more kind of, I guess, friendly way of presenting engineering to women. I always talk about that. Like, when you say you're going to study engineering, or you want to study engineering, everyone goes, oh, you must love maths. And it's like, I have never loved maths. I don't love sitting down doing sums. And if you do love doing sums, you should probably study maths, like math science, not engineering. And maths is a tool that I've got in my toolbox to actually achieve things in the real world. It's something that I'm good at. It's not something that I don't fall asleep at night thinking about, oh, I'm going to do so many sums tomorrow. So I think that, like, that it's that approach, and then like that, you know, being in a world full of men all the way through, I guess that didn't intimidate me at all. And then finally, yeah, absolutely, being in engineering, there were a good few people from my class that I had gone all the way through college with who became entrepreneurs. They were all men, and I saw them out there doing it, and I kind of was like, well, you know what, if he can do it, I know I can do it, because I spent 4 years in the classroom with him, and I know there's nothing he can do that I can't.
You know the capabilities of everyone. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And Claire, back to you in that regard. in terms of your own, you're the founder of Teletherapy, startup medtech company, you know, that breaking the bias in terms of, you know, I suppose you would have been, I mean, you would have been expected to go on, I'm presuming, the speech therapy route like everyone else, and to get, you know, a job doing speech therapy. What made you think, you know what, I can do something different, I can be an entrepreneur? What kind of gave you that confidence?
I guess, was it initially a panic of would there be a job for me as a speech therapist? And I also had this idea in college, and my dad has his own business, and I remember going home being like, I have an idea of this app that can help people. And, you know, we spoke about it a lot, and what would you need? Like, really naive at the time, like, I'd need someone to help me with legal stuff, and I'd need someone on the tech side. And I definitely think it was that encouragement from home of like, this is definitely possible, that really helped me. And a good question, no one had actually ever asked me that before, but I think that then the initial, you know, where to start, someone pointed me in the direction of Ignite, and my first call with Eamon Curtin, who runs it, like, it was just so encouraging. And, you know, absolutely, we can help you, this is definitely something that we can make happen. But I do think in college, a lot of the time, the careers are very, you know, you're studying speech therapy, you will be a speech therapist. And I am still a speech therapist, but I'm just being a little bit inventive, and I suppose helping more people, hopefully, with the creation of teletherapy. So I think definitely it has been encouragement from home, from family and friends, and then the support of Ignite, but maybe not necessarily from the college profession itself of going in a direction that's different to the norm.
It's funny because I know it's not on the same scale, but Holly Cairns spoke about the top-down approach to drive influence, and that's relevant in your personal life at home too. Like, that it's very important for that support to be there for young girls, that they're told from top down in society and from top down at home that they can do whatever they want to do. They can do absolutely anything they want to do, but whether it's start up a company, or be a carpenter, or be a speech therapist, be a primary school teacher, whatever you want to do, you can do. I might move on to Mairead, actually, because Mairead, your intake in terms of accountancy, in terms of ratio men to women, was very much 50-50. Am I right in saying that? You're on mute there, Mairead, sorry. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I studied accounting in UCC, and there was quite a good mix of females and males in my course, and then moving on to a Big Four accountancy firm, professional services firm, it was quite even as well, and which is great to see. I never felt, you know, any disadvantage because of my gender during my time in the Big Four. Now I stayed there, so you know, there's a very linear level of progression in there. It's kind of pointed out from you. You know, you become an associate, then a manager, then maybe a manager too, and then senior manager, director, and then maybe partner. So I think while it's good in that the more junior levels and maybe the middle to management levels, there isn't really much of a gender bias. I think, as a lot of you've already touched on, it's more the leadership roles or the partner levels or the higher levels that there isn't such a good balance. It is still male dominated, and I do think it is harder for women to get into that level, unfortunately, still.
And why do you think that is, Mairead? Is it a and I've spoken an awful lot about this in the run-up to International Women's Day, that at some point the onus seems to fall a lot, and I'm not saying all the time, but a lot, on women to take that step back if they, you know, if they do want to have a family, or if they, you know, do want to, I suppose, go maybe a different direction in their personal life, that it's that, you know, requirement to take a couple of years out. Is that maybe a reason for it, or what is the reason for it? Why is it a 50-50 intake, and then when we get to the higher levels, it's not 50-50? You know, I mean, by law of statistics, it should be 50-50 if it's a 50-50 intake, you know?
Yeah. So I do think there's a mix. There's not just one answer to it all, but from what I could see, I think, and what all of us have touched on, that everyone needs a mentor. You need to see it, you know, needs to be visible, whether it's an Olympic medal or it's a working mum making it to partner. I think when you see it, it's when you feel you can achieve it. And very much so, I can only speak about my personal industry, but very much so, to get into those higher levels, you do get a mentor that brings you up and, you know, tells you what you need to get involved in. And I suppose if statistically it's more men, you know, it's going to be more men mentoring the men underneath them. And I think that, not that they just mentor the men underneath them and want to bring them up, I just think it's more culturally, it happens that way because culturally, I don't know, I don't want to say a men's club, but from my experience, you know, be very often there would be maybe more male dominated events happening. So there might be a partner might be taking a client out to a game, and you are naturally going to bring maybe the junior underneath you that's a male, or it might be a golfing session, and then there's just more opportunities then for, I suppose, a male to get that personal relationship or to get that connection with a mentor. And then, you know, a mentor is more likely to take the male under their wing then, unfortunately, you know, rather than the female. There's less opportunities, I think, culturally for women to get, you know, that kind of mentorship. And
in terms of what you've done yourself with the Tax Nerd, do you think that social media has enabled a bit of, I suppose, a breaking down of the bias and a breaking of that gender issue? You have 16,000 followers, all people wanting to know what tax is about. Explain it properly to me, you know? Like, did social media, do you think, play a role in allowing you to do that and in allowing you to succeed in that area?
Absolutely. I think social media gives such a great network, as I said, and mentorship for women. It gives women that kind of boys club, I suppose, automatically, because I think Holly might have mentioned earlier that there is a massive female following on Instagram, as there is males, but I think it does open up a lot more networks and mentorship and role models for women. And I suppose the other thing with my page, I don't feature on it personally very much. It's very much about the content and the value. So then I think that's great in terms of, it doesn't matter about my gender, you know, it's just the value that's being added, you know, nothing to do with whether it's coming from a man or a woman. So it's definitely allowed that to not be a factor, I suppose.
Okay. Carol, if I can ask you a quick question as well, just in relation to, I suppose, you're CEO of Baseworks. You're currently, am I right in saying, studying for a Master's in Science, Master's of Science in Technology Management? I think I'm right in saying that. And I suppose what I'm curious about in your own experience, Carol, is how you manage the day-to-day responsibilities that you have with Baseworks while also studying. Is it, you know, are the supports there that you need, being a woman doing that? And do you feel you have the same level of support as a man would?
Well, I do feel loads of support, and especially like after I moved to Ireland from Hong Kong, because as Marie said, it probably some kind of like culture things right there. And especially I'm coming from a very traditional like Asian family, like especially like in my age, people are probably like expecting that I probably will have some children. I need to, you know, like support my family and all of that. But no, I'm not ready for that. I need to, you know, purchase my career. I need to do what I really want to do. So I do think that like after I moved to Ireland, I do get a lot of support, you know, comparing with my time when I was in Hong Kong, because like, for example, I got the scholarship from 30% Club to support me to have my master's degree in NUI Galway doing my technology management. Even though like when I was doing my undergrad, I was studying in political science, which is like completely a whole different ballgame right there. But like at the same time, like apart from like working day to day, and also like studying, also like during the weekend, I'm also like, as Grainne mentioned, that I was also like involved in Junior Chamber Ireland last year when I was a national president, and it's a voluntary role. I don't get paid to do all of that, but I do think that like in Ireland, I do have a lot of opportunities for me to spotlight myself, and especially like we're talking about it's International Women's Day, and I'm actually the minority woman in Ireland, and I do need a lot of I do need to put a lot of effort to, you know, showcase myself, to let, you know, people know about me. So like I do think that like in Ireland in general, I do get a lot of support, but of course, Basework, my company, like they all aware that we are like we are a super diverse team. We have like in the leadership role, we do have women in the leadership role, and even though like in the company we have a lot of like ethnic minority in the company, we do believe that like as a company, if you include everyone coming from all around the world, coming from different cultural background, you actually would do a lot better, you know, to run your own business. So that's from me.
Well, Carol, actually, I wanted to ask you about that as well, because I was aware that, you know, obviously you have your own experiences coming from Hong Kong, and I was curious as to how they compare with Ireland and how you felt accessibility to do what you wanted to do in terms of your career compared. I know you mentioned before that in Hong Kong, you know, the maternity leaves, for instance, differ. That is it 10 weeks in Hong Kong?
Yeah, like I would say that they just recently increased 4 more weeks. So right now, women in Hong Kong, they have like 14 weeks. But compared with Ireland, we have like 26 weeks. Like in Europe, some other countries, in Nordic countries, they have a lot more weeks, you know, for the women to support them to raise their children and all of that. So I do think that like in Ireland, the government, they do a lot of work. They try to, you know, like provide the whole system to support the family. Like for the Irish mummy here, they have like the child benefits, and you have a lot of like free child support system right here to help the family to, you know, to have a work-life balance. But unfortunately, in Hong Kong, I can share with you, ladies here, that in Hong Kong is another story, because the living cost is very high. So after the maternity leave, their mother will need to go back to work right away, because like it's super expensive of everything, childcare. There's no that we don't really have like so much, you know, like free support out there. In the whole you know, in the public sector especially. So if you would like to get some kind of like private support, of course, you can hire a live-in, you know, helper to help to take care of the family. But like it is not going to be long-term, because like you are not going to, you know, achieve that kind of you know, the harmony to try to, you know, bring the women, you know, to back to the workforce. You're not doing that, you know, like from society as a whole. So I do think that like Ireland or in Europe generally is doing a lot better, you know, compared with the Asian countries. Yeah.
I suppose, you know, in terms of the points you made there, though, but I do think there still is an issue in Ireland in terms of childcare. It's one that's often discussed in the Dáil. It's one that's a huge issue for a lot of parents, and it's becoming a thing in Ireland where it's, you know, both in many households, both need to work, but it's falling an awful lot on the woman to decide, it's not going to, it makes no sense for me to be working because childcare is so expensive. So it's interesting to hear about that international comparison. I suppose, Carol, did you know, in terms of your own experience here and in Baseworks, did you come across or encounter any stumbling blocks being a woman being a woman, I suppose, you know, juggling as well the masters that you're doing? Did you encounter any stumbling blocks along the way?
Well, I think I'm super lucky, Fiona. Like seriously, because like I do think that like since the time I moved to Ireland, everything is just very smooth. I was actually mentally expected to have some kind of like blocks, barrier. I was actually mentally prepared that I might have some maybe discrimination, but unfortunately nothing. So I just,
that is fantastic to hear.
Yeah, I just think that of course I heard some stories that's coming from other people that they have some like horrible stories, you know, like being a minority women and all of that. But I think sometimes it's your personal, your individual, you know, thinking, your own mindset. If you come across something, you know, like you feel uncomfortable, you really need to, you know, like stand up right there. You need to really like voice that out. You need to let people know about it. But like for myself, I'm super lucky, and I do think that I have a very huge support around me to make sure that I have the wonderful experience, you know, like in Ireland, in base work, in NUI Galway, doing a master and all of that. Like I do want to, you know, shout out for everyone who supported me along the way when I'm in Ireland.
That's great to hear, and it's great to hear that on International Women's Day that we are doing something right. So it's brilliant to hear that. And I'm actually going to move over to you now, Anne, very excitingly with us here this morning, Head of Financial Management and Reporting at AIB. And tell me a little bit, I suppose, about from your own experience, and you have 30 plus years experience in the financial services industry. What more can be done to break the bias in terms of the financial services sector? You know, succeeding, I suppose, in a male-dominated environment can be challenging. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. And we are seeing changes for the better as well, but also a lot more to do. Like if I go back 4 years to 2018, the 30% Club did a review of financial services, and particularly looking at the pipeline of female representation in financial services. And the results were quite stark. And this is 4 years ago, and quite typical of what Mairead spoke of. Females represented 54% of our management, 4 levels down from the CEO. But as you moved up to the CEO level, and particularly 1 level down from CEO, they only represented 28%. You know, so this was quite stark, and I suppose it reminds me of my own career. You know, AIB at that time, back in 2018, their ExCo and board female representation were at 22% and 21%. So there was very little female role models within the organization. And when I look back to my career back in the Stone Age, when I joined AIB, you know, the girls were sent to type, the boys were put on cash, and you never questioned why. Started out in branch banking, and a lot of the senior managers were male, moved into finance, and a lot of the senior managers were male as well. So you never really questioned it. But if I move on 4 years now to today, and over the last 4 years, our ExCo and board have been 50-50 gender split, which is absolutely super to see. We have 5 female ExCo members, 4 who've grown up in the organisation as well. So it's really great to see that they have grown up. Their careers have been in AIB as well, and you know, they have had very successful stories that they can relay to staff. One was appointed while she was pregnant, and she's about to go on her second maternity leave as well. So I never had those role models growing up. So how wonderful is it for our junior staff to see that. And just even in our pipeline and our talent pipeline, our graduate intake was 50-50 this year. And I can see AIB being involved in very positive things around, you know, returners program. You know, we spoke about STEM, and, you know, trying to get women to be more involved in STEM. So our technology area are working on a returners program, which is great to see women who have been out of the workforce but have a very specialist skill. And delighted to see Emily being involved in STEM. And we're doing a lot of work in primary schools and in secondary schools in relation to try and introduce that quite early on in somebody's kind of schooling, so that, you know, they won't shy away from it when they do go into an organisation. But personally, what I see is a change in mindset, a change in awareness, and, you know, a lot of male allies there as well, which is really positive, but a lot more to do, and particularly at that level between kind of level 5 and 6, between CEO and level 4, a lot to do. I'm involved in a mentoring program in AIB, and we had 180 applications for the program this year, and it's a program to support the advancement of females within the organisation. And just out of curiosity, we did a scan of the word confidence in the applications that come through. So we asked them questions about, you know, what you want to get out of the program, what's held you back, and the word confidence appeared 434 times. And it just goes to show you that, you know, there's still that issue with women, and whether it's that they're coming back to the workforce after being out on maternity leave, or whether they're stuck in a rut, or just there's something going on in their careers that they have that lack of confidence. And it's great to see those small changes in the program. It only runs from March to December. We take a pre-program survey and a post-program survey. One of the questions is, I understand my strengths. At the start of the program, they answered 35% only understood their strengths, but by December that had gone up to 95%. So it just shows that by working with a mentor, you know, how it can change mindsets of staff as well. And we would have 50-50 gender split on our mentor panel as well. So, you know, that's great to see that our male senior leaders are supporting this program as well.
I was actually going to ask you that, what more can men do to help? But you mentioned the term male allies there. It seems like, you know, that there has been a huge change, certainly from AIB's perspective, in terms of, I suppose, the progress that's needed on closing those gaps, those gender gaps. So it must make you, I suppose, it must be a source of pride for you to compare when you started. You know, it's fascinating to hear the stories that, you know, men were put this way and women were put a different way on tasks, and never questioned to where we're at today. And we're making sure that there is, you know, hopefully there's a fair ratio of men and women coming into the programs. Is that a source of pride for you, Anne?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And you kind of you think back to when you started out in your career, and you kind of go, why did I never question those things? But it was because you never had those role models there. You know, I was doing my accountancy finals, and I was pregnant at the time, and I told my boss at the time that I was pregnant, and he went, "Oh, well, that's the end of your accountancy." And he didn't mean anything bad by it, I don't think, but that was just the mindset, you know,
Mindset,
that
the way it was.
you know,
Mhm.
it makes you more resilient. I kind of went, well, I'll show you, you know, and I did go on to get my finals, but it was things like that where you kind of, you know, it did make you maybe step back a little bit. And I don't think anybody meant any badness by it. It's just the way things were.
It was the mindset. That's what we've been, you know, what we've been
Totally.
talking about, that attitude that just it needs to change. And it's so, like, it's inspiring for someone to hear that you said, well, I'll show you. But for every, you know, for every person that's like that, there could be 2 or 3 people that think, okay, that's me done. That's me done.
Exactly.
So it's great to hear that those supports are in place. I suppose, Anne, in terms of, you know, the discussions that we've been having today, would you hope to see, not just in your own sort of industry, but in other industries, the work that's taking place in AIB, would you like to see that replicated in other industries as well? Do you think that would, you know, if that was put in place, that when we're talking on International Women's Day in the coming years, that we might be talking a little differently about things, particularly in terms of career?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Like it's been proven that diversity, you know, both gender and just diversity of thought, diversity of background at the board table, it helps to make better decisions, and you know, helps with the risks in our business as well. You know, that has been proven. You know, so you would like to see that. You would like to think that you know, you won't have to have a mentor her program in a few years' time. You'll just have a leadership program. You won't have to do these stats in relation to males and females, because we'll just talk about leaders. You know, that International Women's Day, we'll be just leaning in and supporting each other, that we won't be talking about these issues. And that's ultimately, I think, where we want to go. We do have a long way to go to getting there, but I think we're making great progress.
I actually think that's a fabulous place to stop the panel discussion, because it's really summed up everything we've been talking about this morning. So before I hand you all back to Fiona Ryan of the Ludgate Hub, I just wanted to thank all our participants today. It was great to shine a spotlight on all that's been achieved, all that needs to be done in terms of closing the gender gap and empowering a more equal society. So hopefully this time next year we'll be talking about all that has been achieved. I know, for instance, we saw yesterday that Minister O'Gorman announced the introduction of gender pay gap reporting. So let's hope that initiatives like that will have a positive impact. Thank you all once again. It was such a brilliant morning and so insightful and thought-provoking. So I really appreciate it. And I'm going to hand you back over to Fiona Ryan now of the Ludgate Hub.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you to all of our speakers this morning. Fiona, you're a fantastic moderator. You kept that conversation really lively. So it was so engaging. So thank you so much. You know, Holly said that Emily inspired a whole generation. Well, each and every one of you have inspired me, and I'm sure have inspired our attendees this morning. And I'm sure you inspire people within your specific sectors as well, and within your specific organisations. No doubt a lot has been done. A lot does need to be done in the future, and we need to continue these efforts, and not just on one day of the year. As Holly pointed out, some people do have a love-hate relationship with International Women's Day. So we do need to continue our efforts, and it can't just be for one day. And those policy considerations at government level and education is critical. It is key. And whether we're doing it in our schools or whether we're doing it within our organisations, they're very, very important. And hopefully we can make an impact on that 135 years to close the gender pay gap. Hopefully we can reduce that once we amplify the message. So you have great programs out there like 20 by 20. If she can't see it, she can't be it. 30% Club, Mentor Her, Nurture Her. They all help to amplify the message, but even amplifying it further within the organisations by taking the AIB model, having those programs to help women succeed. Confidence is an issue, but drawing on what Emily said there, the path to success is not linear. Keep your goal in mind. And maybe one of those goals for us females is to increase our confidence. So what can we do to achieve that? So I'm certainly going to take that on board, and I might just put that up on the wall beside my desk and adopt the roar mentality. To close the session out there, it's 12:14. I know we've slightly ran over than what was advertised at 12 o'clock, but it was just so engaging. I'm so thankful to our audience today for registering and joining us, To our speakers, I know time is a precious commodity. I really do thank you for coming on board today. You're a fantastic group to work with. Event coordination can be tricky at times, but you were so accommodating in our prep calls and so on and so forth. To Davidus, because all of this, there's a backroom team and they all make it happen. Davidus on tech support, Mary, Elma, thank you so much for all of your marketing efforts, driving the attendance numbers, driving registration, and thank you to our main sponsor, AIB, as well. So on that note, and feeling very empowered and energized to go back to my work desk and to achieve for the rest of the day and the rest of the week and the rest of the year, I thank you all.
Thanks,
Fiona.